For weeks, Elara circled the room like a hesitant satellite orbiting a silent planet. Her late husband Arthur's study, untouched since his departure 6 months prior, pulsed with a presence heavier than absence. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light, illuminating shelves groaning under the weight of lives lived only in print, a desk frozen mid-thought, a leather armchair holding the ghost of his posture. She knew she had to dismantle the shrine, pack away the man who existed now only in memory and ink. But every object whispered his name. Every shadow held his shape. Today, spurred by a looming deadline and a quiet desperation for air, she finally crossed the threshold. The scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, and quiet grief enveloped her. Yet, as her hand hovered over the first stack of his meticulously ordered manuscripts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the room wasn't just holding memories, but guarding a secret. What undiscovered truth was waiting within these walls, heavy enough to anchor her soul even as she tried to set it free? Welcome to a new short story from English Plus Podcast. Today's story is The Weight of an Empty Room. We're going to talk about the story. We're going to discuss the story later. And of course, because this is English Plus Podcast, we're going to discuss some of the words that we use, some of the vocabulary, so we can use them in our speaking and writing. But now, without further ado, let's start with The Weight of an Empty Room. The key turned in the lock with a sound like a sigh, exhaled after holding one's breath too long. Elara pushed the door inward, the hinges emitting a faint, protesting groan, a sound that hadn't disturbed the air in 6 months. Arthur's study. It wasn't empty, not truly. It was crammed full of his absence. A palpable thing that pressed against her eardrums and settled like sediment in her lungs. Sunlight filtered through the perpetually dusty window panes overlooking the overgrown knot of the back garden, cast long, distorted rectangles across the floorboards. Dust motes, disturbed by her entry, swirled in these golden shafts like tiny, frantic constellations. The room smelled of him, or rather, the things that had surrounded him. The sharp, acidic tang of aging paper, the sweet, lingering ghost of cherry pipe tobacco from a habit he'd never quite kicked, the faint, leathery perfume of the worn armchair, and underlying it all, the dry, quiet scent of stillness itself. For half a year, this room had been a sealed chamber, a Pompeii of the mind preserved not by volcanic ash, but by the paralyzing weight of grief. Elara had navigated the rest of the house, a large, rambling Victorian that now felt cavernous without Arthur's booming laugh or the rhythmic clack of his keyboard, by skirting this particular door. It was a magnetic pole of sorrow she dared not approach too closely, lest its force pull her into an orbit from which she might never escape. But reality, in the form of dwindling savings and the gentle but firm suggestions of her pragmatic niece Maya, had finally intruded. The house was too large, too expensive, too full of echoes. Selling it was the logical step, and selling it required confronting this final bastion of Arthur's presence. The study needed to be cleared, its contents sorted, assessed, disposed of, or archived. It needed to become just a room again, stripped of its sacred, suffocating aura. Elara stood just inside the doorway, her hand still resting on the cool brass knob, feeling like an archaeologist entering a tomb, both reverent and trespassing. Where to even begin? The sheer volume of stuff was overwhelming. Arthur, a historian specializing in the obscure corners of medieval monastic life, had been a man pathologically incapable of throwing anything away. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, floor to ceiling, double stacked in places, their spines a chaotic tapestry of faded gilt lettering and worn cloth bindings. History, philosophy, theology, poetry, a map of his formidable intellect. His desk, a vast mahogany plane, was an archipelago of paper islands. Stacks of manuscript pages, meticulously handwritten notes on yellow legal pads, opened books bristling with bookmarks, correspondence from fellow academics, a scattering of pens, a cold pipe resting in an overflowing ashtray shaped like a gargoyle. It looked as though he had simply stood up mid-sentence and walked out, intending to return in moments, not depart entirely. Her eyes drifted to the armchair by the window. Deep, cracked leather, the color of dried blood. The imprint of his body seemed permanently pressed into the cushions. How many hours had he spent there, reading, thinking, staring out at the unruly garden, a cup of tea growing cold on the small, ring-marked table beside it? How many times had she come in, perched on the armrest, interrupting his thoughts with some domestic triviality or a shared observation, only to be met with that slow, considering smile that always made her feel like the most fascinating interruption in the world? The weight in the room wasn't just grief. It was the density of a life lived with fierce intellectual passion and quiet, unwavering affection. It was the accumulated gravity of thoughts thought, words written, connections made. And now, it was her task to dismantle it, piece by painful piece. She took a breath, the dusty air catching in her throat, and stepped further in. Her sensible shoes made soft thuds on the worn Persian rug. The intricate patterns faded beneath the desk and chair where feet had rested for years. She ran a finger along a bookshelf, leaving a clean streak in the gray film. The titles swam before her eyes: Bede, Aquinas, Hildegard of Bingen, obscure Latin chronicles bound in cracking vellum. Each book felt less like an object, more like a repository of Arthur's time, his attention, his very essence. To pack them away felt like packing him away. A small framed photograph on the corner of the desk caught her eye. It was from their trip to Lindisfarne 20 years ago. Arthur, his graying hair whipped by the North Sea wind, squinting happily into the camera, his arm around her shoulder. She remembered the salt spray on her face, the cries of the gulls, the sense of standing on the edge of the world, steeped in the very history he loved. He looked so vital, so permanent. The contrast with the silence of the room was a physical blow. She picked up the cold pipe from the gargoyle ashtray. She'd always nagged him about smoking it indoors, the sweetish smell clinging stubbornly to the curtains. Now she lifted it to her nose, inhaling deeply. Faint, so faint, but unmistakably his scent. A tear escaped, tracing a surprisingly warm path down her cool cheek. She quickly wiped it away. Sentimentality wouldn't clear the room. "Right," she murmured, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. First things first. She decided to start with the correspondence. Letters seemed less daunting, more ephemeral than the books or manuscripts. She sat carefully on the edge of the desk chair, his chair, the leather sighing beneath her slight weight. It felt wrong, like sitting on a throne belonging to an absent king. The letters were a jumble. Notes from former students, now academics themselves, debating obscure points of Carolingian script. Invitations to conferences in cities they'd explored together: Rome, Paris, Heidelberg. polite rejection letters from publishers for book proposals deemed too niche, and amidst the professional clutter, tucked into a worn manila folder labeled simply personal, were letters Elara hadn't seen before. Her breath hitched. These weren't addressed to colleagues. They were drafts. Letters Arthur had written or started to write but perhaps never sent. One, on the university letterhead, was addressed to his estranged brother, Michael. It began with awkward pleasantries, then veered into a tentative attempt at reconciliation, referencing a childhood argument over a toy soldier that had somehow metastasized into decades of silence. The writing was cramped, sentences crossed out and rewritten. It ended abruptly mid-phrase. Perhaps it's foolish to think that after all this time. Elara hadn't known he tried to bridge that gap. Arthur had always presented their estrangement as a mutual stubborn impasse. Seeing this vulnerability, this unfinished attempt, cracked something open in her chest. He hadn't been solely the stoic scholar. There were hidden currents beneath the calm surface. Another draft, on cheap lined paper, was addressed to her. It seemed to have been written late at night, the handwriting looser, more emotional. "My dearest Elara," it began. "There are moments, sitting here in the quiet, surrounded by the voices of the long dead, when the silence feels accusatory. Have I given enough? Not to history, not to the endless pursuit of footnotes and forgotten monks, but to you, to us. This life of the mind is a jealous mistress, I know. Sometimes I look up from these pages and see you in the doorway, patiently waiting, and I feel a pang of guilt sharper than any critic's review. Have I sequestered myself too much? Left you rattling around the edges of my world?" The letter trailed off, unfinished, unsigned. Tears pricked her eyes again, blurring the ink. She had never felt like she was rattling around the edges. She had felt anchored by his quiet presence, his intellectual gravity a reassuring constant in her own, more fluid world. She painted landscapes, mostly vibrant splashes of color that stood in stark contrast to the monochrome texts filling this room. But to know he had worried, had questioned the balance, it added another layer to the man she thought she knew so completely. She spent the next few hours sorting through papers, boxing up correspondence, creating piles. Keep, archive, discard. The process was slow, emotionally taxing. Each artifact demanded attention, triggered a memory, forced a small reckoning. Lecture notes, filled with his familiar annotations and underlined passages, brought back the image of him pacing through students, bringing dusty history to life with infectious enthusiasm. Old receipts tucked into books revealed forgotten dinners, trips to antique shops, the small mundane transaction that accreted into a shared life. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, turning the dust motes from gold to rose. Elara had made tangible progress. Several boxes were filled, labeled in her neat script, but the room felt no less dense, no less Arthur's. If anything, disturbing the surface had only stirred up deeper layers of memory and emotion. Her niece, Maya, arrived as promised at 5, bringing takeaway containers of fragrant Thai curry. Maya was 25, sharp, kind, but relentlessly practical. She surveyed the room, the boxes, Elara's weary face. "Making progress, Auntie Elara?" Her tone was gentle, but held an undertone of purpose. Maya was the executor of Arthur's modest will, the one navigating the practicalities Elara felt utterly incapable of facing. "Some," Elara admitted, gesturing vaguely at the boxes. "It's slow work." "Of course it is," Maya squeezed her shoulder, "but necessary. That said, the estate agent wants to come by for a preliminary look next week." Elara's stomach tightened. An estate agent. A stranger invading this space, assessing its square footage, its potential, stripping it of its soul and reducing it to market value. The thought felt like a violation. So soon? Better to keep the momentum going, Maya said, unpacking the food onto a cleared corner of the desk. Look, I can help for an hour or two now, if you like. Tackle some of the books? Elara hesitated. Part of her craved the help, the buffer Maya's practicality provided against the overwhelming tide of emotion. But another part felt fiercely protective of this process, this intimate, painful dialogue with her husband's ghost. Thank you, dear, but perhaps I need to do this part myself, she said slowly. The books feel very personal. Maya nodded, understanding flickering in her bright eyes. Okay, but don't let it bury you, Auntie. It's just stuff in the end. Is it? Elara thought, looking at the shelves laden with the weight of centuries, the weight of Arthur's life's work. Is it ever just stuff? They ate their curry amidst the paper islands on the desk, the incongruous scent of lemongrass and chili mingling with the room's established perfume of dust and tobacco. Maya talked about her job, her roommate dramas, the normal forward-moving current of life that felt utterly alien within these four walls. Elara listened, offered vague responses, her mind continually drifting back to the letters, the books, the sheer, immovable presence of the man who wasn't there. After Maya left, promising to call tomorrow, Elara turned back to the room, the evening shadows now pooling in the corners, deepening the sense of intimacy and enclosure. She felt a strange reluctance to leave, as if breaking off the process now would leave something vital unfinished. Her gaze fell upon a stack of manuscripts tucked away on a lower shelf, separate from the main body of his academic work. These weren't neatly typed or bound. They were piles of handwritten pages, some on legal pads, some on university stationery, some on the backs of discarded flyers. The top page bore no title, just Arthur's familiar, slightly sprawling script. Curiosity, stronger than her weariness, pulled her towards it. She knelt on the rug, the fibers rough against her knees, and carefully lifted the top manuscript. It felt different from his usual work. Heavier paper stock, denser ink. She turned the first page. It wasn't history. It wasn't footnotes or analyses of monastic charters. It was a story. Prose, fictional characters, dialogue, descriptions of landscapes she didn't recognize. The salt wind scoured the cliffs, it began, carrying the scent of rain and absence. Elias stood on the promontory, the gray sea churning below like a troubled conscience, and felt the old lie stir within him. Elara frowned, leafing through the pages. It was a novel, an unfinished novel. Arthur, the meticulous historian, the man dedicated to verifiable fact and rigorous analysis, had been secretly writing fiction. She had known he read novels voraciously, had strong opinions on style and structure, but she never imagined. She scanned the pages, her heart beginning to beat faster. The handwriting was undoubtedly his, but the voice was different, richer, more personal, tinged with a melancholy and a searching quality she hadn't encountered in his academic writing or even in that unfinished letter to her. It told the story of a man haunted by a past decision, living a secluded life, grappling with secrets and the weight of unspoken truths. There were passages of startling beauty, descriptions of light and water, the texture of stone, the nuances of silence that resonated with a poetic sensibility she hadn't known he possessed, or perhaps hadn't allowed himself to fully express elsewhere. She read on, sinking onto the floor, leaning back against the bookshelf, utterly absorbed. The manuscript was substantial, hundreds of pages, but clearly incomplete. The narrative arc was visible, the characters compelling, but it stopped abruptly, mid-chapter, mid-sentence, just as the central character Elias was about to confront the source of his long-held secret. Why had he never told her? Arthur, who shared his research breakthroughs, his frustrations with university bureaucracy, his delight in finding a rare first edition, Why had he kept this hidden? Was it a private indulgence, a secret ambition, or was there something in the story itself, something too personal, too revealing, that he couldn't bear to share? The discovery shifted the atmosphere in the room again. The weight was still there, but now it had a new dimension. It wasn't just the weight of his absence, or the weight of his known work. It was the weight of this hidden life, this secret creative current running beneath the surface of the man she loved. The room, which had felt like a mausoleum, now felt like a treasure chest, prematurely sealed. She stayed there for hours, reading, rereading passages, the floor growing cold beneath her, the only light the angled beam from the desk lamp illuminating the pages. The story echoed in the stillness, filling the space Arthur's physical presence had vacated. It was like finding a hidden room within a familiar house. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through her absorption. Should she destroy it? This was unfinished, private. Perhaps he wouldn't have wanted anyone, even her, to see this vulnerable, incomplete part of himself. The idea of the brisk estate agent or even well-meaning Maya stumbling upon it felt profane. She looked around the room, at the evidence of his meticulous, ordered public intellectual life. Then she looked down at the sprawling, passionate, unfinished manuscript in her hands. Two Arthurs seemed to inhabit the space now, the historian and the hidden novelist. No, she couldn't destroy it. It felt too vital, too much a part of him. It wasn't just an unfinished story. It was an unfinished piece of him. And perhaps, she realized with a jolt, it held the key to understanding the weight she felt not just in this room, but in her own life now. The weight of things unsaid, unexplored, unfinished. A new resolve settled over her. Clearing the room was no longer just about packing boxes and meeting deadlines. It was about understanding. It was about engaging with the totality of the man she had lost, including the parts he had kept hidden. She gathered the loose pages carefully, protectively. She wouldn't pack them away in a box labeled manuscripts. She would keep them out. She would read them again, slowly, carefully. She would live with this revelation, with this other Arthur for a while. Rising stiffly, Elara walked to the window. Outside, the garden was submerged in darkness, but the moon cast a silvery sheen on the wet leaves. The room behind her no longer felt solely like a place of ending. The discovery of the novel, of this secret spring of creativity, had introduced an element of continuation, of unexpected legacy. She looked at the desk, the chair, the books. They were still Arthur's things, imbued with his presence, but now they felt different. Less like relics, more like invitations. Invitations to understand, to connect, perhaps even to continue. The thought was tentative, fragile, but it was there. She wouldn't clear the room tomorrow, not completely. The estate agent would have to wait. There was something here she needed to engage with first. She went back to the desk, picked up one of Arthur's favorite pens, a heavy fountain pen with a silver nib, and held it, feeling its cool weight in her hand. Then she sat down in his chair. It didn't feel like trespassing anymore. She pulled the unfinished manuscript towards her, the desk lamp casting a warm circle of light on the pages. The weight of the empty room hadn't vanished. It had simply changed its nature. It was no longer just the oppressive burden of absence, but the complex, challenging, and strangely vital weight of a life revealed, a story waiting, perhaps, for its ending. And in the quiet solitude, surrounded by his books and his absence and his secret words, Elara felt, for the first time in 6 months, the tentative stirring of her own beginning. The room wasn't empty. It held the echo of his voice, and now, the nascent possibility of hers. Alright, my friends, I hope you enjoyed the story. Now, let's talk a little bit about it, right? So we just walked through Elara's journey in Arthur's study, didn't we? That feeling of standing at the doorway of a room heavy with absence. It's something else. I wanted to capture that sense of paralysis, that almost physical weight grief can have. It's not just sadness, it's like the air pressure changes, like you're moving underwater. Have you ever felt that way about a place or even an object tied so strongly to someone you've lost? It becomes more than just a room. It transforms into this bastion of memory, almost a living entity holding its breath. And what struck me while writing Elara was her quiet strength beneath the surface of her grief. She's not passive, she's observant, thoughtful, even when she's avoiding the inevitable task. The story is really about that internal struggle, the push and pull between preserving the past exactly as it was and the necessity, the need to allow change, to let air into the sealed chamber. It's terrifying, isn't it? The idea that interacting with those memories, sorting through those objects, might somehow dilute or change the person you're trying desperately to hold on to. And the room itself, I tried to make it almost a character. The dust isn't just dust, it's time made visible, layers of stillness. The books aren't just books, they're extensions of Arthur's mind, his passions. The armchair, you can almost see the imprint, can't you? Using these tangible things to represent the intangible, that's the magic of metaphor, I think. It lets us touch and feel abstract concepts like memory and loss. Think about the pipe, a small, almost insignificant object, yet it holds his scent, a direct sensory link that cuts right through the numbness. It's these little anchors that often keep us tethered, for better or worse. Then there's the discovery of the letters, and especially that unfinished novel. Now, talk about throwing a curveball into Elara's perception of Arthur. We all contain multitudes, right? We present certain facets to the world, even to our loved ones. But often there are these hidden rooms inside us, filled with secret hopes, fears, maybe even secret creative endeavors like Arthur's novel. Finding that manuscript wasn't just about finding hidden pages. It was about discovering a hidden dimension of the man she thought she knew inside out. It complicates him, makes him more human, more mysterious, even in death. Does it change how she grieves? How could it? Suddenly, she's not just mourning the historian she knew, but also this secret storyteller. It raises so many questions. Why did he hide it? Was he afraid? Ashamed? Or was it just something deeply, irreducibly his? That moment where she decides not to destroy the manuscript, but to engage with it, that felt like the turning point. It's a shift from preservation to interaction, from mourning what's gone to connecting with what remains, even the unexpected parts. It doesn't mean the grief disappears, not at all, but its quality changes. The weight is still there, but maybe it becomes less of a crushing burden and more like the title suggests. The complex weight of a life fully considered, secrets and all. It's not about erasing the past to move on, but integrating it, carrying it forward in a new way. Have you ever discovered something unexpected about someone after they were gone? Something that reshaped your memory of them? It's a strange, unsettling, yet potentially profound experience. It reminds us that people are never just one thing. And maybe grief isn't just one process either. It's layered, complex, and sometimes, surprisingly, holds the seeds of a new beginning, right there amidst the dust and echoes. Well, my friends, that was my own reflection on the story. And now let's talk about some vocabulary. It's English Plus after all. So let's dig into some of the words from Elara's story and see how they work. Sometimes specific words just capture a feeling perfectly, don't they? Now let's start with palpable. In the story, Arthur's absence was described as palpable, meaning it was so intense it felt almost physical, like you could touch it. Now, you might use this in everyday life too. For example, you could say, the tension in the room was palpable after their argument. Or, there was a palpable sense of excitement before the concert started. Well, it's great for describing strong atmospheres or emotions that feel almost tangible. So, that was about palpable. Let's move on to the next word. There's sediment. Now, in the story, there was this grief settled like sediment in Elara's lungs. Now, think of how sediment, tiny particles like sand or silt, settles at the bottom of a liquid over time. Metaphorically, it suggests something heavy, persistent, that accumulates quietly within you. You could say, for example, years of resentment had settled like sediment in their relationship. So that was about sediment, my friends. Next, we have bastion. Now, we mentioned bastion in our chat just now. The study was a bastion of memory. A bastion is literally a fortified area or structure, a stronghold. Figuratively, it means something that strongly defends or upholds particular principles, attitudes, or activities. So, the study was like a fortress defending Arthur's memory. You might hear someone talk about a university being a bastion of academic freedom, or an old bookshop being a bastion against digitalization. So, that was about bastion. Next, let's talk about pragmatic. Elara's niece, Maya, was described as pragmatic. Well, this means dealing with things sensibly and realistically, based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. Maya focused on the practical need to sell the house. Now, we all know someone pragmatic, right? The friend who tells you to stop dreaming and make a budget, or the colleague who always finds the most efficient solution. We can say, for example, she took a pragmatic approach to fixing the leaky faucet herself. So, that was about pragmatic. Next, we got a word that I really love, ephemeral. The professional letters seemed less daunting than the books because they felt more ephemeral. Ephemeral means lasting for only a short time, fleeting or transient. I think of mayflies or a beautiful sunset. They are ephemeral. Now, you could say, for example, the ephemeral nature of fame, or enjoying the ephemeral beauty of cherry blossoms. Then we got the word accrue. Now, we talked about the small, mundane transactions that accrued into a shared life. Now, accrue means to accumulate or receive payments or benefits over time. Now, we often use it in finance, like we say interest accruing, but here it means how small moments and experiences build up to create the substance of a life or relationship. You can say, for example, over the years, they accrued a vast collection of memories. Or, wisdom often accrues with age. So that was about accrue. Next, we got sequester. Now, Arthur worried he had sequestered himself too much in his study. To sequester means to isolate or hide away. He felt he might have shut himself off from Elara. It can be used for people isolating themselves. For example, he sequestered himself in the library to finish his thesis, or even for juries during a trial. We can say the jury was sequestered during deliberations. So that was about sequester. Next, we got incongruous. Eating Thai curry in the dusty study created an incongruous scent combination. Incongruous means not in harmony or keeping with the surroundings or other aspects of something. Out of place. That's incongruous. So spicy curry doesn't usually mix with old paper and pipe tobacco, right? Now, you might notice an incongruous detail like, for example, a clown wearing hiking boots, or feel something is incongruous like loud pop music playing at a solemn ceremony. So that's incongruous. Next, we got nascent. At the very end, Elara felt the tentative stirring of her own nascent beginning. Nascent means just coming into existence or beginning to display signs of future potential, like when we say budding. It suggests the very early stages of development. Think of a nascent idea, nascent political movement, or the nascent stages of a project. It implies potential and newness. And finally, Arthur was described as a meticulous historian, and his manuscripts were meticulously ordered. Now, meticulous means showing great attention to detail, very careful and precise. He wasn't sloppy. He cared about accuracy and order in his work. You might describe someone as a meticulous planner, admire someone's meticulous craftsmanship, or talk about the need for meticulous record keeping. So these are the words that I wanted to share with you from the story. And thinking about these words, how does the language used shape your understanding of Elara's emotional state? And can you think of a time when a place felt like it held a palpable presence for you? Think about the words this way, and you will make those words part of your active vocabulary bank. Don't just listen to me and understand what they mean. Well, that's great, but that's not enough. If you really want to make these words and phrases your own, you have to think about them. You have to use them. All right? And now let's move on to our last section of the story where we're going to discuss the story. I'm going to present you with some questions, and of course, you can discuss these questions with your friends, with your family, with me, of course, on the website, on our Patreon page, wherever you like. Now, let's start with the first question. The story title is The Weight of an Empty Room. How did the story explore different kinds of weight? Emotional, physical, metaphorical. Did the nature of that weight change for Elara by the end? My second question is, Elara discovers Arthur's unfinished novel and his unsent letters. How does that discovery change her perception of him? Do you think we can ever truly know another person completely, even those closest to us? Well, think about that. And now for the next question. Maya represents a pragmatic approach to dealing with loss and the practicalities that follow. How does her presence highlight Elara's own internal conflict? Is one approach necessarily better than the other? My next question is, consider the ending. Elara decides not to clear the room immediately and sits down with Arthur's manuscript. Is this an act of avoidance or a step towards healing and integration? What do you imagine happens next for her? And my final question is, the story uses the study and its contents as central symbols. What other symbols or metaphors stood out to you, and what did they represent? So, I want you to think about these questions, my friends, and of course, as I told you earlier, you can share your answers with me, or you can discuss these questions with your friends, with your family, with anyone who's interested in this story or in fiction, short stories in general. And with that, we come to the end of our episode. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope you enjoyed the analysis afterward, the words we talked about, the discussion questions and everything. And remember that if you want to have access to all our episodes on English Plus Podcast, you can do that by becoming a premium subscriber on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. You can find the links in the description of the episode. With that being said, thank you very much for listening. I'm Danny, and this is English Plus Podcast. Remember, never stop learning.